afternoon, everybody. My name is Deborah Tyler, and I'm the Associate Executive Director of the National Association of Elementary School Principals. And we are bringing this webinar to you today in partnership with the National Association of Secondary School Principals and Prince George's County Public Schools. So we'll be talking today about creating space for building your leadership real estate. And this will be presented by Susan Holliday, who is with Prince George's County Public Schools. Much of this work that we'll be talking about today is steeped in the 5 key practices identified by the Wallace Foundation for Principal Leadership. So the Wallace Foundation has done a number of research studies around school leadership, and in particular principal leadership, around what are the 5 key practices for most effective student achievement and most effective school leadership. So the 5 key practices that they have identified are shaping vision, creating a climate hospitable to education, cultivating leadership in others, improving instruction, managing people, data, and processes. So the Wallace Foundation has completed over 70 research studies, and they have worked exclusively in school districts such as Prince George's County Public Schools. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the presenter today. Her name is Susan Holliday. She's the newest addition to the Office of Talent and Development, and she's currently serving as Principal in Residence in Prince George's County Public Schools in Maryland. She's served as Principal at Gladys Noon Spelman Elementary School. She has been in an administrative role with Prince George's County since 1997, beginning with the assistant principalship at Seat Pleasant Elementary School. She's also served as a regional instructional specialist, principal at Seat Pleasant Elementary School. Ms. Holliday earned her Bachelor of Science degree in elementary education at Elizabethtown College, and a Master of Science in Administration as well. So we are very honored today to have Susan with us. I can attest to the great work that Prince George's County Public Schools has done with their Principal Pipeline Initiative and their Principal Supervisor Initiative. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Susan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Debbie, for that wonderful introduction. I hope I live up to all of those expectations. What we're going to do today is just provide you a brief overview of the objectives, and Debbie shared with you those 5 key practices from the Wallace Foundation, and I really believe through today's work we will really try to hit many of them. But our focus of our work today will be will be around identifying the difference between technical and adaptive work. We're going to engage in a few activities that will assist you with identifying areas in your current school that can help establish themselves as instructional leaders. And, you know, unsure of who our audience might be, but many of us will be able to engage in that work through the lens of an assistant principal, a principal, or if you are a central office or even an aspiring leader. I truly believe that this information and some of the activities will be valuable. One of the major focus areas from the Wallace Key Practices is going to be on cultivating leadership in others. So just as a brief activity, and we'll definitely work on this a little bit later, is how do we divide our work? So I'd like all the participants, including you, Debbie, is to make a list of 5 things that you've done in your job in the last 5 days, anything. So just a list of, you might put classroom observation, you might put cafeteria duty, you might put parent conference, anything that you would have done during the scope of your job, and this would apply to assistant principals, principals, central office, and if we have a couple aspiring leaders out there too. So I'm going to give you about 30, 45 seconds to write down 5 things you've done in the last couple days. All right, Debbie, you have your 5 things?
I have my 5 things, and so I want to take the participants into a deeper context around the what and why we are doing this. So a few months ago, Prince George's County sponsored an assistant principal symposium, and there were assistant principals from the state of Maryland, from Virginia, at this great symposium that they sponsored. And so this presentation today is an offshoot of one of the presentations that happened that day at the symposium. So in doing this, I'm going to put on my assistant principal hat. And so as an assistant principal, 5 things that I would have been doing in the past 5 days, I could be doing some work around test coordinating, definitely attending to cafeteria and bus duty, and those things tie into discipline as well. One of the other things I would be doing would be classroom observations, meeting with parents, and also attending to my own professional development.
Thank you, Debbie. I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of circle back with the AP Symposium. So for those of you that actually went to the AP Symposium, some of which is going to be review work and some of which will just be an opportunity for further dialogue and question. And for those of you that are new to us today, through our partnership with NAESP and NASSP, hopefully this content will be beneficial to you each and every day. But thank you, Debbie, for the kind of the context in regards to how the webinars came about. Next. Just a brief conversation around how we are organized within Prince George's County Public Schools. Before you is our Coherence Framework. And I did want to take a few minutes to talk through this Coherence Framework. It is part of our everyday work. It truly allows us to do the complex work that we do every day, but with alignment. So the visual that you have is from the PELP framework out of the Harvard School of Education, but this is specific to Prince George's County. So the outer ring, where you see organized for collaborative work, building assessment literacy, data overview, that wording all around the outer ring is the data-wise improvement process, which is also out of Harvard. And those of you that are familiar with the data-wise improvement process, those words and those actions are kind of bring a bell to you. And for those of you that are not, it truly is a systemic school improvement process. And you'll hear some of that language throughout the course of the presentation today. The next inside ring, culture, structure, systems, resources, and stakeholders. Those are what we call the 5 elements of our Coherence Framework. How do we organize ourselves? And in my opinion, they're really thought partners. We're going to be using those 5 words later on to do some thinking through a big idea that you might want to try to implement at your school. The next piece is our theory of change. And the theory of change is if we use culture, data, and performance with a lens on literacy, we'll have academic achievement for all students. That language and of culture, data, and performance. And if you heard the words of our Deputy Superintendent, you'll hear culture was not put first just by chance. It's for a reason. We truly have a tunnel vision focus on culture. The next inside ring, the yellow-orange area, is the 5 pillars of our strategic plan: academic excellence, high-performing workforce, safe and orderly environment, family and community engagement, and organizational effectiveness, along with academic excellence. I can't remember which one I started with, but those are the 5 areas of everybody's work within the school system. If you are a bus driver, if you are a cafeteria worker, if you work in human resources, if you're part of our maintenance support staff, everybody can fall into one of those 5 pillars. And those 5 pillars are surrounded by the heart of our work every day. These are our clients. These are the people that we service in our instructional core: the student, the teacher, and the content. And what I find to just be fascinating is that regardless of your role within the school system, it is supporting that instructional core. And as a leader and a previous principal within the school system, that was the heart of our work. You know, there might be conversations that take place amongst teachers or parents, and we always had to look through the lens of the instructional core. Is this what's best for the student, the teacher, and the content? So it really allows us to not only have this common language, but it also allows us to say, you know, regardless of our role within the school system, we're supporting that instructional core. Debbie, any other questions or any other thing, just because you've heard those that wording in that framework before, that you thought would be beneficial for everybody?
Right. So, you know, as you have described this, there's a lot of questions going through my head. I mean, first of all, I mean, this is excellent work, and you bring it back to culture, and we all know in everything that we do in schools, and I know we've heard the phrase culture trumps strategy. If you don't have the right culture in place, you'll never move a school system, a teacher, a principal, or anyone who touches that school district. So can you talk to me a little bit about the process the district took to build this framework? How many years did it take to be actually an active part of your culture?
I think we deliberately began looking at culture. This is probably year 3, or 2.5, since we're in the middle of a school year now. We had a change in leadership with Dr. Kevin Maxwell returning to our school system as our chief executive officer. He was a principal in Prince George's County, went on to be an administrator in another school system, and then went on to be a superintendent in a neighboring school system. And then he returned back to what we consider to be home in Prince George's County. And one of the biggest pieces of his work for the last 2.5 years has been this focus on culture. A couple different strategies to address culture, because I think as we develop the leaders in our school system, culture is not something that's always addressed deliberately, nor is there a process to say, well, how do I develop this culture? So I think our school system has used, a couple different strategies in order to address culture. One of them is using the book Leadership and Self-Deception through the Arbinger company, and it was a book study that was done at the executive cabinet level, but then a training that our school system has done for close to 2,000 employees. And this really speaks to how we treat each other. How do we interact with each other? Do we see each other as objects in order to get our work done, or do we see people as actual people in our work? And as I attended one of the Arbinger trainings in order to, at least get a deeper dive into that work, I sat in a room of current principals. I sat in a room with a secretary of an executive cabinet member. I sat in the room with there was a special ed coordinator. It was a range of people. It wasn't just executive cabinet. It wasn't just principals. It really speaks to that coherence framework that expectation is for everybody in our school system. It's not just for certain people. That when we pick up the phone and we interact with each other, there is a standard practice. There's a common language on how we interact with people. The second is our deep dive into Strength Finders work through the Gallup. And all of our principals and assistant principals and many of our central office leadership have taken the Gallup Strength Finders assessment and have identified the 5 strengths. And if you get emails from Prince George's County employees, our 5 strengths are actually, a lot of us have identified them in our email. And this really changed the culture of the school system, that, many times principal advisors or central office, as we work with the schools, would say, well, they need help in this, or I'm going to go in and fix this because they're not very good at this. It now changes of, here's their strengths, here's how they work, here's what makes them a strong person, and I'm actually going to coach them through their strengths. So I am an achiever, responsibility, learner, belief, and individualization. And if you know any work around the Strength Finders, those also fall in domains. And so it really allows the principal supervisors who act both as evaluators and as coaches to coach their principals through their strengths. So, prior to walking in the door, they would say, okay, well, if I'm going to go meet with Susan Holliday, here's what she does well. Here's her strengths. And at the same time, there's a transparent conversation about, as the principal supervisor or as the principal with her members of their leadership team, here's how I work. So if I am a context person, then the minute you ask me to do something, I'm going to ask you a ton of questions, and because it's important for me to have context of that situation. It really has changed how we work with each other. It actually has made us understand each other better. And there is a ton of research around Gallup and the Strength Finders assessment and how true it is. I learned a whole lot about myself, and none of those things really surprised me. It made me better understand how I work, but it didn't necessarily surprise me that I fell into those top 5 strengths.
I think that's fascinating because, a lot of times when we're talking about school improvement and improvement district-wide, sometimes we tend to focus on what I describe as a deficit model. Where are our deficits, and really trying to fix that. But you and your district took a totally different tact with this and really identifying people's strengths and building upon them. That's very unique. You don't see that a lot, but it is so much needed, I feel, in the world of education. So thank you for that explanation.
And what's so interesting is I think it has better allowed the work that we're doing around leadership teams to have a better function because principals will share their top 5 strengths, and in the case of a high school which might have 6 or 7 assistant principals, they are sharing their top 5 strengths. So you can look at a leadership team which might have 6 or 7 administrators on it and say, well, how do they work? Do I have the right people doing the right work? Do I have relationship building people on my team? Do I have people that are strategic planners? Do I have people that fall into domains that fit not only what they're strong at, but we also can be coached in other areas? And we have several, I think a good 15 to 20 people within our school system that are actually certified as Strength Finders coaches. So we actually can coach. If you don't have relationship building in one of your top 5, you actually can be coached in that strength to bring it out. And Strength Finders doesn't necessarily say you have deficits. They just have less dominant strengths. And I think that wording is pretty powerful too, because we all have areas that we want to work on. But when we say the word weakness, it kind of tends to say, well, it's a negative thing. So when we speak about something that might be less dominant, it also allows us to change the culture on that conversation.
So this whole framework and the work that you've done in your district around Strength Finders, has this also filtered down to parents and students as well?
I think the language might not be hitting that particular area. I think it really has improved the way that we've done and interacted with as a school system in regards to employees. As a somebody that was a principal less than 7 months ago, my staff knew what my top 5 strengths were. So when I speak about my responsibility and I'm in your classroom observing your class, and they'll say, well, is she in there again? And they would say, you know what, she's a responsibility is one of her top 5 strengths. She's going to make sure that she takes that responsibility. She takes it very seriously. So I don't believe that it's filtered all the way there, but I hope and I wish that the conversations and the way we interact amongst people, meaning our students and our teachers, has absolutely changed through this use of strengths. So as I was preparing and doing some preparation for this whole notion of technical and adaptive, and our work that we'll be looking at today is through Ronald Heifetz, I came across this quote that I really think speaks to a lot of how we struggle with some of our work every day. The single most common source of leadership failure we've been able to identify in politics, community life, business, or the nonprofit sector, and I also just personally added education, is that people, especially those in positions of authority, treat adaptive challenges like technical problems. And for those of you that are not familiar with adaptive, the difference between adaptive and technical, we're actually going to unpack that in the next couple of slides. And this is going to come back because it is very important to treat an adaptive challenge like an adaptive challenge and a technical challenge like a technical challenge. Next. Here's a very, bird's eye view of the difference between technical and adaptive. A technical challenge, challenges that can be solved by knowledge of experts. Change has a clearly defined problem, a solution, and implementation. And the contrary would be adaptive. Change must come from new learning and come from the collective intelligence of employees at all levels. It is really important to see when it comes to adaptive is this collective intelligence. You are going to struggle taking on an adaptive challenge by yourself. I consider it to be a no-win situation. And when we look at some of our leadership challenges that we have, I work very closely with new principals in our school system, and some of the developing assistant principals is if you think about the work that you need to do and you divide it between technical and adaptive, it actually might help you attack the work differently. You know, the first example that comes to mind is this whole concept of mission and vision building within a school. If you're going to develop a mission and a vision within a school community, if you treat it as technical work, you would be sitting in your office doing it by yourself. If you treat it as adaptive work and you look through that lens of collective intelligence of employees at all levels, it's going to take time, it's going to take other people besides yourself, and a lot of it's going to take new learning. And so there are many, many pieces that we can go through and give these school-based examples of how to attack work within a school and through leadership, dividing between technical and adaptive. Next. I thought this organizer, which came from the Center for Integrated Leadership, really does a little bit more in regards to identifying this technical versus adaptive. But the other area that this falls into is that technical and adaptive work. So technical work, as we've talked about, is a clearly defined problem. There's a clearly defined solution, and the primary focus of that responsibility would be authority. So I'm going to go to the third one when it comes to adaptive. It requires learning, the solution requires learning, and you're viewed as a stakeholder. For those of us that have been in education for a while, or for those of us that might be new, is if you go through the lens of authority throughout the course of the day, one, it's going to be a pretty lonely place, and two, you're not going to get much buy-in from the people that you work with. There are opportunities and there are clear examples that somebody has to be in this line of authority and make decisions, but that should not be the norm of your work. And as we're all developing our leadership skills, we are going to fall into that lens of technical and adaptive. That the problem might be clear. I know exactly how to, what the problem is, but the solution might require learning. And that there's going to be an equal balance of authority and stakeholder involvement. So this chart really allows us to see, and I think the most important piece is the responsibility of the work, that when you do technical work, you're exercising your authority. When you do adaptive work, you're actually exercising stakeholder, but I also believe that background lens of just leadership behavior. Debbie, any questions or?
Right, so I'm making connections again with what you're talking about, and so for those of you in the audience, is another way to frame this would be through Marzano's work where he talks about first order change and second order change?
Absolutely. I think if we go back to that example that I gave of mission and vision building, it's change, it's second order change. It's going to take a while. You're going to be a stakeholder in the work. Yes, there's a problem. We don't have a mission or a vision that speaks to the work. So there's a problem. But at the same time, in order to solve that problem, you're going to have to take on new learning. What does the community think our school is about? What words describe the work that we do? What do we believe in? And so to resolve that problem, meaning vision, mission and vision, it's going to take both exercising some authority, but at the same time, this clear angle of being a stakeholder in the work.
Right, and the other thing that I think about in this, too, is, Wallace talks a lot about, principals not always being what we call the first responder in situations in schools, and really empowering others through their assistant principals, through their teacher leaders, that, there are other go-to people in a school building who keep things running, who have clear understandings of the different parts that need to come together to make it whole.
And absolutely, referring back to one of those Wallace key practices of cultivating leadership in others, is the reality is the principalship, the assistant principalship, and even a teacher leader, you cannot do it alone. We do need to cultivate this leadership, and this framework kind of allows you to be able to help frame and build other people's leadership, that there are going to be times where you're going to show them a technical skill. The first example kind of is the master schedule. The physicality of if you have a school information system and that's how you have to do your master schedule, there's a lot of technical work. For those of us that are on through Prince George's County, our school-based management system it's technical work, but at the same time, there is a whole adaptive piece of that. What does our schedule say about us? How do we schedule students? What does it say when we place a student in an honors class for one particular then they need some support, and we're going to put them in a different. So the schedule, although it might appear to be very technical work, there's a lot of adaptive challenges in that, and or there's adaptive networking that needs to take place during that.
The master schedule is a great example for that, because when you think about a master schedule, it's technical when you look at it on a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. But the thought that goes behind that is very much adaptive, because you are building that master schedule to be adaptive and meeting the needs, first of all, of your students, and also creating that time and space for teachers to teach and collaborate. Definitely.
Definitely. Well, now let's go to some of those examples that you wrote down, Debbie. So what was one of the, I want you to take a couple minutes, those 5 things, and for the individuals that are on the webinar is to take your 5 things that you wrote down and either put, if it's on a list or on a piece of paper, is put either a T if you think it was technical work, and A whether it's adaptive work. Now that you know a definition of technical and adaptive, and if you could turn back to the slide that actually says the difference between technical and adaptive, people can look at their lists. Thank you so much. So let's talk through a couple of those, and then we're going to actually take a poll on a couple of the examples. So Debbie, what was one of the ones that you talked about?
So why don't we do one of the all-time favorites of all school administrators, especially assistant principals. So why don't we go with is doing the cafeteria duty one we could go with?
Definitely. I think that's one that we're going to talk about in our poll. So how about we go to?
Oh, okay. I can choose another one. Well, yeah, how about most assistant principals are the test coordinator?
Sounds good.
So
test coordinator. And what would you list that as? If you had to list it as your immediate kind of new leader lens, what would you have thought you would list it as?
Well, I would think coming into it that it would be very technical, but as you work through the process, I think it is a combination of technical and adaptive.
Very much so. I think I might say my age a little bit, that I was around for the days of our state assessment that when it was called MISPAP, and we had all of these performance tasks. And I was putting together these kits that would have to go to all of our 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade classrooms. And I was putting soil together, and I was organizing materials, and it was a lot of organization, and it was a lot of technical work. But then we got the results back, and they would look at me and say, Susan, tell me how to read these results. What do these results say about my classroom? What does it say about me as a teacher? That's where that technical work turns the corner. It becomes adaptive work. So the test coordinator, through the lens of the beginning learning, especially when we're going on to online assessments and teaching teachers how to navigate the online piece, you do need to make that technical work. They need to know how to support their students in the classroom when it comes to the technology. There's a lot of us that have a variability of level of comfortable with technology. So there's pieces of it that you have to treat as very technical, that if you get too deep in the weeds and the theory behind why we're going to online testing, they're going to look at you and say, can you just tell me what you want me to do? How do I help a student with the computer? So that lane could be very technical. Then we do have to turn the corner about adaptive when we start looking at the content that we want them to teach on the computer, and how do we support them with analyzing the results. So the test coordinator is a wonderful example of how it really is a combination of, and as somebody that might take on the test coordinator position, and maybe you're the assistant principal that oversees that test coordinator. Think about it. How do I teach the technical work to them, and how do I coach them through that adaptive work? Because some of them might understand how the test results are read, but they don't know how to share that and coach a teacher through that work, so that it then becomes a learning experience and not just a telling experience.
Right. I mean, and as a test coordinator, the big technical piece is, you're setting the schedule with the various tests and everything, but also the adaptive piece comes into play. You mentioned with the online testing piece, but also the adaptive pieces and all the many accommodations that students have rights to, keeping up with that. So that's very much adaptive.
Very much so. What was your other example that you had?
So my other example,
was it a discipline? The favorite assistant principal job of the firefighter disciplinary?
Yes. That,
And through your new principal or new assistant principal lens, how would you classify that work?
I would say that discipline is very much adaptive.
Yes. I think there are individuals, and I'm going back to the AP symposium. In the session that we had individuals write these topics on Post-it notes. And so we had posters. We had a poster on one side of the room that said technical and a poster on the other side of the room that said adaptive. And we had the participants physically go and put their Post-it notes on the technical and adaptive. And a lot of them put discipline in the technical piece because they looked at this authority line and said, well, when I discipline a student, I'm actually exercising a responsibility of authority. And the last thing that we wanted to say is that we all have not felt that way, especially in, you can get lost in that work. You really can get lost in technical work when you're exercising authority and discipline. And so what we challenged the participants and the panel, the individuals that are with us today is how can you make it how can you make that discipline work truly sound like a stakeholder and not an authority figure? I think there might be individuals that approach it as adaptive work, but it sounds authoritative. So when you're having parent conferences and having teacher conferences regarding a disciplinary, are you coming across as a stakeholder? Or are you coming across as this line of authority? And if you're exercising that line of authority, it becomes technical work. But if you approach it as a stakeholder and you're talking to the parent as we need to work together, what can I do to help you? And at the same time, I would hope that the parent's going to come back and go, let's work together in this. But if you call with the authoritative piece, then that's what you're going to get out of it. And know that there are definitely circumstances when it comes to discipline, and some of the challenges that we have with our students is that you do need to exercise authority, that there are severe circumstances where you do need to call a parent or talk to a teacher, and it's going to be in a very technical, authoritative role. So know that I clearly recognize that not everything can be handled as a stakeholder. But long-term resolutions, when it comes to some of our most needy children, need to be handled through a stakeholder. There might be an immediate authoritative fix because of the severity of the discipline, but in the end, if you approach the next steps as a stakeholder, I think you're going to have a better long-term solution with that student.
Right. I mean, as we've talked more through this idea about discipline, I mean, I see it too also falling within the technical and adaptive range as well, because when you think about discipline in a school, pieces of it are very cut and dry. It's driven by the codes of conduct that you have within your district, and then that's adapted to the school. And so, those stagnant rules and consequences that we put up in our schools and in our classrooms, to me, that's the technical piece of it. And the adaptive piece is really using those rules and consequences to communicate to your stakeholders and really forming that partnership with teachers, parents, and students around. Discipline should be not just punitive, but you're always looking for that teaching moment in there as well.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Very much so. Next. So Debbie and I have had an opportunity to share some of our thoughts, and so the next piece of this are going to be poll questions. And if we could get some guidance in regards to how we do the poll question. So which area below would you place the classroom observation activity? So going in to do either an informal or a formal observation, and in this situation, anything that would follow after it. Would you consider that to be technical, adaptive? Okay, so the responses came back 75% adaptive and 25% technical. I Absolutely 100% agree with this. We have a pretty technical platform that we work with within our school system, but the work behind a classroom observation, especially when we go back to that instructional core through our Coherence Framework, it truly is adaptive work. If in order to use the observation process, it is to build the capacity of the teacher. There are times that you're going to exercise authority because their evaluation needs to take place, and there are some situations where you do need to exercise authority in that situation. But the day-to-day work, the informal observations, the formal observations with the feedback to teachers really is adaptive. How do I, based on what I saw, give you suggestions, give you next steps, get your input? What do you need assistance with? What do you need support with? I think that also hits the culture piece. If teachers and our staff are viewing every time you walk in their classroom as an evaluative piece, they're going to view it as technical because you're exercising authority when you walk in the room. In lieu of, if you walk into a classroom and you exercise yourself as a stakeholder, then they're going to view this as adaptive work. And it really could be a physical presence in the room. It could be a relationship that you build in the school about how you're going to go about doing classroom observations. Debbie, anything you'd like to say regarding the classroom observation?
No, you hit on a really key point of, the whole point to me of doing classroom evaluations. Of course, we understand the evaluative piece to that, but the most important piece to that is that teacher feedback and really, helping that teacher hone in and improve those teaching skills. So that piece of it is very, very much adaptive, depending on the teacher and the skill set that they possess.
Definitely. So if we could get some assistance with the next poll question. So which area would you place the cafeteria duty activity? Everybody loves their favorite cafeteria duty, the ones that you have to go and monitor the cafeteria. So how would you place that in the technical category or the adaptive category? So again, I'm not too surprised about the split between 45% being technical and 55% being adaptive. And I think you could place cafeteria duty, bus duty, hall duty, bus duty, any assigned duty that both an assistant principal, a teacher leader, a principal has could be replaced with that language, and you probably would get a similar result. There is a definite technical aspect to these type of responsibilities where you do exercise authority for safe and security in a building, something that we all strive to do each and every day. So when you have bus duty out front, or you have car rider duty, or you are in the cafeteria making sure that the students are safe, you definitely are there as a point of authority. And if we go back to the, we think back to the chart, that is a technical skill. You do need to exercise authority. They need to know that they're safe and secure. But there are opportunities with all of those different assigned responsibilities to make them adaptive. I've seen some wonderful pieces of especially in some high school cafeterias where they'll have a table and they're allowed to play music because they've earned the right to be able to play music at their table. Or I've seen opportunities where staff members, even if they're not on duty, will come and sit with their students to create this experience where, you can see me more than just your teacher. I'm actually somebody that cares about you. So I think the real push here when it comes to looking at the what might be perceived as very technical work is creating spaces for adaptive work. And that really is going to be what we're going to be talking about the next part of the presentation. But I think that there are missed opportunities for many of us because we get lost in that technical work and we lose sight of the fact that these are actually adaptive opportunities for us as leaders in a school.
I really agree, and especially, when we talk about the safety issues, involved in this type of setting, but also, in talking about, a lot of schools, and it comes back to culture, a lot of schools have, positive behavior approaches throughout their entire schools, and so I've been in many different schools, and those who who embrace PBIS. I've seen some of the structures that are in the classroom move into the cafeteria and other spaces in the school, and also those schools who are involved with responsive classroom as well. I see many of those same things that play out school-wide within that cafeteria and during bus duty and other areas as well.
Yep, definitely. So I think, for those of you that are listening and those of you that will listen in the future is, the big takeaway when it comes to looking at what might be perceived as very technical work is in the back of your head, how do I create an opportunity to make this adaptive? And I think the other piece is living in this area of technical is not always the most enjoyable experience. I think the missed adaptive opportunities would actually make your day much more pleasant if you have used what might be really open up the opportunity to create adaptive. It will make your day more enjoyable. Are there anybody that have questions or ideas? If you could write them into the question box, we'll take a few moments to have any of our attendees write questions before we move on to the second part, and we'll just take a couple minutes for any questions to come in. Or if anybody else has another scenario that they'd like to try to talk through, that's something Debbie and I could talk through. If you just want to type in a scenario too, we could also be able to talk through that too. So we'll take a few minutes.
That would be great.
One moment, we do have a question. How do you have staff see these duties as adaptive?
I think one, that's a great question. And I'm sure Debbie would agree. I think it goes back to as for culture. How do they perceive you during that time period? And if we'll go back to that cafeteria example, is that if you show up in the cafeteria, you are the assistant principal, the principal, and the minute you walk in the door, you take the microphone and all you do is talk about very technical things. So if a staff member, a parent, a student, the only thing they're going to see is you exercising authority. But they can actually visibly see you in there interacting, laughing, joking, helping. I lived in the land of elementary school, helping them open up their milk cartons, talking about their day, interacting with them, reading their fortune cookies, all of those different things that would really provide a culture and a climate where it's interactive, then they're going to perceive you that way. And the other thing that comes to mind is that's a process. You don't just do it one time. Like today I'm going to go into the cafeteria and I'm going to be adaptive. That's got to be what you do every day. They need to see you through that lens on a regular basis. And for many of us, regardless of what's going on, what we walk into the building with every day is making sure that we're very deliberate about our behaviors, that we can't choose to turn them on and turn them off. There's going to be days that are going to be more challenging than others, but when the staff sees you on a regular basis interacting that way, then they're going to, I guarantee you, be even more inclined to be helpful because they see that your enjoyment and what you can gain out of it. And the exact opposite is going to take place. If they see you exercising that line of authority, then they're going to do what the authority says and not necessarily about how do I create that adaptive time for myself.
That is so true. And I mean, the other thing with this too is that, when you are trying to build these adaptive structures into your work, it really helps to have all the other key stakeholders with you planning this and executing this, and sometimes some of the things that you plan don't work, and so coming back around the table together to really peel the layers apart and talk about, the best ways to come at it a second time, a third time, or even more until you get it to where you feel it's right, just involving people in the work that you're trying to do within the school, no matter where it is in the building or in the classrooms. That piece is so important.
I think it also speaks to this whole concept of a leadership team again. Has the leadership actually sat down and said, what do we want our cafeteria to feel like? Even though there might be individuals that are going to be there to monitor, what do we want it to feel like when you walk in? Do you want it to feel like a cafeteria where people welcome and they enjoy those 30 minutes? Or do you want them to feel like, oh my gosh, it's all they're in there to do is to eat? There's so many other things that can take place in a cafeteria, and I'm going back to that example because it's the one that we just talked about. But there are pieces of that you can come to consensus. You can get their input. What do we want this to feel like at our school? And you get that collective buy-in, along with building the leadership and cultivating leadership in others, because you certainly cannot be the person that is in the cafeteria every single day, every single lunch period. How do I cultivate that type of leadership through others? But first and foremost, it starts with an example. You have to create that example for yourself. And in some days, I think there's going to be more challenging. We all have rough days. But they're going to look to you. If you ask them to do that, they're going to look to you and say, well, is she doing that too? Is she acting that way, or is he acting that way? Or are they just exercising authority by telling me that that's the way they want it done?
Those models give permission for others to act as well.
Very much so, very much. I like the phrase of it gives you permission to be able to model the behavior. Definitely. All right, next. So we're going to go to part 2 of our time together today. And as assistant principals, teacher leaders, or even principals, how do you create space for more adaptive work? How do you find that time in the course of your day? And for some of our aspiring leaders, this might also be the trademark of your leadership development. When somebody asks, what have you done within a building? Tell me about a leadership highlight. What is your trademark? If I asked members of the community, this is what they're going to remember if you've created space for this adaptive work. I'm sure if a principal supervisor asks a principal, so how is that assistant principal doing? What might come out of their mouth, it could be, oh, they are the best cafeteria manager I've ever seen. Or it could be, you know what, they created this after-school program and it was based on data. You know, what do you want to be known for within your building? So we're going to go through this concept of a big rock, and we're going to ask you to think about 2 or 3 items that your school is focused on. And if you could, again, like we did before, is just write 2 or 3 things. You know, it's now more than halfway through the school year. A lot of our schools are going through strategic planning now. They're looking back at what they implemented this year. Did it work? Did it not work? What are our big rocks going to be for next year? And, you know, just to wrap your head around what a big rock is, it could be we're really going to focus on questioning techniques. We've looked at all of our formal observations and our informals, and we said, you know what, we need to provide some professional development around questioning techniques. So that might be a focus for next year. Could be writing and mathematics. It could be vocabulary. It could be, you know what, we've looked at our discipline data this year. We need to take on a new discipline system for next year. So if you could write down 2 or 3 items that are just big rocks for your school, and those of you that are in teacher leader positions, what are some of those instructional big rocks that you might be working on as a school? And for our principals and assistant principals, if you're going through some strategic planning for next year, or even think of a rock that you guys implemented for this year, go ahead and write that down, and I'll give you a couple seconds to get it down. So we're going to go back to the Coherence Framework. I spoke about the 5 elements earlier on in the webinar and how we use them as a thought partner in Prince George's County. So I'm actually going to help define those elements, and I just want to remind you again where they are. So they are the data-wise improvement process is the outer circle of our Coherence Framework. In the next inside, the lighter blue, is culture, structure, systems, resources, and stakeholders. And these definitions come directly from the PELT framework from the Harvard Institute. And I just want to be able to, so we have a common language about them. So when we speak of culture, we speak of the norms and the values that drive the behavior and the work. When we look at systems, we look at the processes and the procedures through which work gets done. And as we move through the next couple slides, you're actually going to see examples of this. The structures, defining how the work of the school gets done, includes people, how people are organized, who has the responsibility and accountability for the results, and who makes or influences decisions. Stakeholders, people and groups of people inside and outside of the district. So it might not just be people that are staff members in the building. It could be community members. It could be central office personnel that need to support the work. And finally, the resources and financial resources through the organization, but it also includes people. People could be resources, human resources. It could be physical assets such as technology and data. And for many of the new pieces of work, or for our aspiring leaders and our principals and the assistant principals that are engaging in some of this work, or even their day-to-day interaction with individuals, that this should be a thought partner for them. I sit on several leadership development teams for some of our assistant principals, and it makes up both their principal supervisor, and a central office person, and the focus of that team is just around the leadership development of a new assistant principal. And I've encouraged our assistant principals to have these 5 words on their desktop, by their phone. It makes them think before they act. I've got an irate parent on the phone, and they're upset, and I need to respond to them. So I'm going to think to myself, the culture. What is the culture of this parent? Not the physical, socioeconomic culture, but how have I been asked to interact with parents? Am I to react the way that they react, or do I need to really think about how I'm going to respond? What system do we have in place for responding to parent phone calls? Do I need to give them an answer right now, or can I actually say, I understand your concern, I'm going to consult with my principal, and I'm going to call you back? What structure? How do we log that parent concern? Do we just talk, or do we actually do have a place to be able to log that? What stakeholders might I also need to respond to this parent? Is it only going to be the assistant principal, or do I need to talk to the teacher? And are there resources? When I come up with a plan of action, are there resources that I might need? So I really encourage our assistant principals, as they develop their leadership, is to use this as a thought partner. It really will help you check yourself before you make some decisions, and it allows you to think before you act. Many times, if we go back to that notion of technical and adaptive, is I believe many of us live in the moment of, well, I've got to respond now. Well, there are opportunities, many, many pieces of our work that we actually can take the time to think about how we're going to respond. And I know, just personally, going back to my strengths, and responsibility is one of them, is that I feel like I have to respond. I owe them that explanation, or I owe them that work or that report. Well, let me take the time and actually do it well, instead of just holding myself responsible for it. So if we use these elements of the Coherence Framework as our thought partner to look at one of our big ideas, it will actually help you think through, is it going to be the best thing for the school at the time? It might be a great idea. It just might not be the right time and the right place for it. So we're going to use these 5 words over the next couple slides to think about one of our big ideas. So I'm going to provide you with kind of a school example. At the AP Symposium, I was very fortunate to be able to have a assistant principal with me when I presented, and he is, at the time, was the assistant principal at Glendale Elementary School, and since he has been afforded an opportunity, we started to do a residency program in Prince George's County, so he's now a resident principal at a high school. But he was able to provide an example of one of the instructional rocks at his school, and it was vertical planning. And this slide allowed the participants, and I'll kind of talk through it with you, and hopefully doing it justice for him, is how they came about why vertical planning was important. It wasn't a top-down approach. It was something that came out of a leadership team meeting. They looked at data. They looked at a grade levels data and was trying to figure out, well, what's going on? Like this grade level is doing well, and the skipping one grade level, that other grade level is doing well. What's going on with this grade level? They looked at quarterly benchmark data, some of our more formal assessments within the county. They actually pulled in some work samples. They talked at a staff meeting. They provided some professional development, and they found out after they, as Debbie used the term, peeling back all those layers, that it really was vertical planning. There was no conversations. If it was a third grade collaborative planning meeting, there was no conversations between second and third grade teachers and third and fourth grade teachers. So they decided that, and when I use the term they, I mean the leadership team. It was not the assistant principal and the principal sitting down and deciding in their, and exercising authority. They actually became a stakeholder in the work. And if I remember the situation correctly, Mr. McCrae said it was the leadership team that says, I think we need to have vertical planning next year. And so the next slide, We're going to take a quick time out to talk one more time about the data-wise process before we go to that thought partner slide. I wanted to give you a bird's eye view of the data-wise improvement process. And the mission of the data-wise improvement process is to support educators in using collaborative data inquiry to drive continuous improvement of teaching and learning for all students. And this improvement process is not one that's just done in schools. I'm a member of the Office of Talent Development, which really focuses on professional development for assistant principals, principals, and some of our teacher leaders. We, as an office, are going through the data-wise improvement process. There are every central office, human resources, technology services, plan operations and maintenance. Every office within Prince George's County, along with schools, are using the data-wise improvement process to take a look at, one, how do we look at ourselves, and two, how do we get better? It really is an improvement process. And so there are three phases of the data-wise improvement process. There's the prepare phase. How do you prepare yourself for this type of work? The inquire phase. How do you look into some of what you're doing and to make plans? And then that final phase of act. We've made a plan, we're going to implement it, and we're actually going to monitor what we asked to do. And one of the areas, since we've spoken on culture, is this whole concept of step one of the data-wise process is organizing for collaborative work. Just because you put a group of people in a room together doesn't mean they're going to be able to work effectively together. So when we talk about organizing for collaborative work, there's actually a step-by-step approach to do that. How do you get to know each other? How do you get to know each other's strengths? Many of our teams, whether it's a leadership team, whether it's a team at the Office of Talent Development or Human Resources or the people I work closest with, we need to know how each other functions. They've done the compass points survey. Are you a north, are you an east, are you a west or a south? And that kind of talks about your work style preference. And the best example I can think of is, you have a meeting 4 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's a collaborative planning meeting at school, and it's 4:55, and everybody's ready to shut down, and there's that person that raises their hand and says, I'm just not quite sure what template we're going to use for this planning. And everybody else in the room groans and goes, oh, Lord, she asked another question. Well, if you use your compass points, you would see that they're a west. And the West asks a lot of questions. So it doesn't then become, I can't stand that person that asked the question at 4:55 and I'm ready to leave. It then allows you to understand them a little bit better, and you can actually make light of the situation. Say, okay, there's her West coming out. All right, everybody, let's give her that chance to ask that question. When we speak about organizing for collaborative work, it speaks to how do we interact with each other? How do we organize our meetings? How do we make meetings effective? And we're going to speak about one of the ways that we make our meetings effective using this concept of a rolling agenda. But we live in organizing for collaborative work every day. It's how do we get better at working together? And then this concept of building assessment literacy. We have gotten a big focus on our second grade scholastic reading inventory, that comprehension exam at the elementary school, and then for our secondary schools about the PSAT, using the PSAT as a benchmark for graduation. If those students, based on their scores, how many are potentially eligible to graduate on time? But if you build assessment literacy, and when we talk about literacy, we're not talking, in this context, we're not talking necessarily about literacy meaning reading. It's what do you know about that assessment? How literate are you in that assessment? Have you ever taken the PSAT? What do you know about it? What does it test? How do you read the results of the test? How do you use those test results to be able to make next steps? So this data-wise improvement process really does shape how we do our work. And it is implemented, again, not only at the school level, but also at our office level. So here's an example of Mr. McRae, the assistant principal at Glendale's thought partner and using culture, system, structure, stakeholders, and resources around vertical planning. So I'll kind of walk you through it, and Debbie, if you have any questions as I'm going through, just to let me know. So if they were thinking about, based on a leadership team decision, to implement vertical planning. So first they had to look at the culture. What is the culture of planning at this school? Are teachers used to planning together, or is this going to be something completely new to them? When people sit together, how do they plan? So when you see the concept of data-wise norms, establishing norms is in organizing for collaborative work. What are we going to do? What do we expect of each other in a meeting? Is it okay to take a cell phone call in the middle of a meeting? Are we going to respect each other's time? If I say that the meeting starts at 3 o'clock and I never start a meeting until 15 minutes late, what does that say about meetings? Are they important? Are they not important? If I tell you that the meeting's going to end at 5 o'clock, then it's going to end at 5 o'clock. Do I have an agenda for the meeting? Do I send that out ahead of time so people know what's expected, or they get surprised when they walk in the door? So when we speak about the different items that are in culture, it is what culture is there for vertical planning at a particular school. So they're used to having, when it comes to vertical planning, and that just surface level vertical planning. At the elementary school, it would be grade levels below and above talking to each other. At a high school, it could be 9th and 11th grade teachers talking to the 10th grade English. What are you guys teaching? What am I working towards, so that there would be this cross collaboration and not just living in the moment, just to give everybody a common understanding of what vertical planning is. So when you do some planning, there needs to be action plan items. There needs to be results and next steps. So they were used to having a timekeeper and a note taker. They take notes in a Google Drive, so they're archived. Their way, if somebody can't attend or they need to go back and say, what did we say we're going to do again? There's a place for them to go back in. And they actually have weekly grade level meetings. They're used to meeting, and they're used to collaborating around ideas. And one of the other things that Mr. McCrae mentioned was the plans for a culture of learning that meets the needs of all students. They had to address why a certain grade level was not doing as well as other grade levels, and there's a culture in that building that we're going to meet the needs of all students, not just at one particular grade level. It's going to be everybody. So when we look through that lens of culture, you're looking through, if you're going to implement something new, what is the culture for implementing something new? And it would vary depending on what it is. The next lens we're going to look through is a system. I apologize, Honor, if you could go back. I used the word. Okay, thank you. We're going to look through a system. They already had administrative meetings. They had a system for having those meetings, and they actually had to allocate money because they needed to release some teachers for substitutes. They're used to having professional development. So this whole concept of vertical planning and using it, they're used to meeting and learning together. They already had leadership team meetings, and they had a system of creating staff surveys so that they would get feedback from the surveys. One caveat that I want to mention as we work through these different lenses is there are things that could be put in several different categories. When I think of the staff survey, it is a system, but it also can be a culture. There is cultures in buildings where the leadership never asks the teachers what they're interested in, or what do you think? So is there a culture in the building to be able to when I send out a survey, I'm going to get people's honest response. I don't want you to respond the way you want me to respond. I want you to respond the way you think, the way you actually are feeling. And how does that look like in a survey? The next lens we're going to look at is a structure. They're used to collaborative planning. The teachers provide the time to collaborate. They have a master schedule in place. There's a structure for that type of meeting, and there's concepts of a rolling agenda, and I'm going to put a pin in that just because I'm going to actually show you a little bit about a rolling agenda. We looked at stakeholders. Who needs to be part of vertical planning? Is it just the classroom teachers? Are there specialists in there? Are there special ed teachers, department chairs, admin? Is there an assistant principal that oversees that content area, that grade level that needs to be part of that meeting? Do you have the right people at the table at the time for that vertical planning? And lastly is the resources. Do you need any technology to be able to hold that type of meeting? Do you have access to the curriculum documents that are necessary? Do you have paper and markers and those things to make an effective meeting? Do you have the curriculum maps that are necessary to know what the teaching is? And just to give everybody some information, Performance Matters is a data warehouse for our school system, the students' data warehouse. So do we have access to that, and do we understand how to read those reports? So this document allows Mr. McCrae and the principal at Glendale to think about vertical planning. How did it work? We're going to look through all of those 5 lenses before we then actually implement it. This would be the planning phase of vertical planning. Next.
So can I stop you just a second?
Absolutely.
So, as you've been talking through this, a couple of questions have come into mind. So, first of all, I'd like to get a better definition of how you view leadership teams, who composes those
Okay.
in your district or school, because I just happened to have the great opportunity to spend some time with the Wallace Foundation when they brought 5 districts here for a convening. And one of the things they talked about, especially around the key factor of shaping a vision of academic success for all students, I saw the leaders in the room grappling with what really comprises a leadership team. And it varies district to district, school to school. What is the normal composition of a leadership team in Prince George's County?
So I think, and I know Prince George's County was part of that group there, that it really does vary from school to school. There isn't, you know, an exact answer. You must have this grade level. You must have this department chair. You must have this content. But I think if you look through the lens of what stakeholders need to be part of the conversation, then that will lend itself to who needs to be in the room. And I know for some schools and for some leaders, they send out at the beginning of the year, here's who's on this team and here's who's on this team. And that's the way it is. There also might be an opportunity to be able to say, you know what, is anybody interested in attending the leadership team? Do you actually have this quiet voice in your head saying, I'm actually interested in trying to figure out how all these things work? You know, the leader in me also says you need to have the right people in that room. So it might not be ones that you have to have because of the definition of the leadership team, but you have to have them in there. They could be the naysayers, the ones that question every single thing that you implement in the building. They should be part of that decision making. It could be those individuals that are going to be, they're the achiever. They're really good at putting together a plan and implementing it. You need to have those individuals in there. Many of our schools have actually done strength finders and compass points with their leadership team so that when they go about and do the work, they actually make sure they have individuals that are strategic planners, relationship builders. And just because you might have the most knowledge about it doesn't necessarily mean you're the person to get in front of the staff and talk about it, because they don't, you might not be that relationship builder in that school. So a leadership team can take on many different variations of it, but I think for the purposes of when establishing one is think about whose voices need to be heard. But I also think it's important to think outside the box as you get to know staff, either as a new principal or as an assistant principal that's developing a team. Whose voices do we have to have because I know them well enough and be able to say they're going to question everything we do to begin with, so why don't I make them part of the decision making? So all those questions don't become public questions. I really viewed my leadership team at the school as kind of my vetting one, that we'd talk about ideas. It was a safe place to question. I want them to question me. If they don't think it's the right time and the right place, then when we walk out the door, no feelings hurt. It's just not the time and the place for that. So the leadership team should be a very safe place to ask questions of leadership in the building, but at the same time, you grapple with ideas. And it really is key, do you have the right people in the room? And it might not always be those obvious people. It might not always be the achievers. Maybe you need to have those other individuals just to bring them up. Maybe you have aspiring leaders that are looking for opportunities to show some of their leadership behavior.
Right. I found that interesting, and I was trying to, you know, frame what you were saying as you know, part of my experience as a principal on, you know, who actually comprised my, who I would identify as my leadership team. And so I think a lot of it really depends on the context of the school. I know it's very different in elementary schools and middle schools and in high schools, because in high schools you have more assistant principals, you have department chairs, and so for me it was like a nested doll scenario. You know, there would be my core people, my assistant principals, you know, who were connected at my hip with me in making decisions, but then I would broaden out and bring in the school psychologist, the social worker, the counselor, and then go and, you know, cast the net even wider depending on the situation. So with the school, with this vertical planning piece, do you happen to know how many times a year do they sit and do this vertical planning? Is there a schedule set up to accomplish this?
I believe it was, without knowing a definitive answer, I believe it was something that was done quarterly, because it was around making sure that if they were looking at either student data or even an opportunity to kind of look at a problem of practice. Like one grade level is really struggling with multiplying fractions. Use that as an example. What are the prerequisite skills that a student would need in order to multiply fractions? Was that something that was taught in that grade level? Or if it's third grade and they're multiplying fractions, they would look at the second grade. Show me how you taught multiplying fractions. And it's not a judgment statement like you didn't do a good job, but maybe this is how you taught it, so when I'm teaching multiplying fractions, I'm not doing the same exact thing. Maybe I'm not using the same language that you used. So the opportunity for vertical planning is not to pass judgment around what took place, but an opportunity to make sure that we make connections that students were previously exposed to.
Okay. Thank you.
The other piece that I wanted to mention regarding the leadership team, especially at the high school level, is that it builds this common language. So if we're going to talk about vertical planning and we're going to go and spread it outside of the leadership team, we're going to use the same language so that if we don't come up with this common language amongst each other as we build the leadership capacity, it's going to end up looking disjointed. And it makes me think of the Coherence Framework is, where would vertical planning go into the Coherence Framework? You don't want teachers to think that this is another thing that you're asking them to do. So as you develop your plan for the the vertical planning and how you're going to roll it out to the staff, you really should take a look and say, okay, where does this fall into the Coherence Framework when I present it? Staff needs to know that there is alignment with the work, and a lot of times, because it came out of a leadership team decision, the leadership team should be the one to give you that backstory, that context as to how we got there. Many times if the assistant principal and the principal presents it, it's regardless of the backstory, it's going to look like it's an exercising in authority. So just to give a little bit, we've used the term rolling agenda, and this, I think for anybody that speaks to a rolling agenda and how we've used it, and for me it's a lifesaver. The rolling agenda is an agenda. It's an electronic agenda, but it's a structure in which meetings are held and facilitated. I have a couple screenshots of it, and so they're key components. The objectives are written there, the time allocations are there. The opportunity, because it's a Google Doc, can be shared with others. So if Debbie is in the meeting with me and I've got all of my leadership team there, we all have access to the document and we can take notes as we're working. And it also allows, well, there's a link that I want everybody to read this article. I can actually embed the link in the rolling agenda. So when I send it out and I ask you to read an article before you come, they're not saying, oh, I don't know where the article is. Where's the article? It actually is in, it's in the agenda. And there's, before you close out a meeting, you take a look at what are the next steps, what did we say we're going to do, and you actually assign tasks. If we're leaving a vertical planning and we say the next step is to do a learning walk into several different classrooms, it would have a timeline on that. And what I think is one of the neatest aspects of the rolling agenda is this concept of plus deltas. And you'll see that in the upper left-hand corner of the screen that I think hits culture pretty hard is what worked well today. In this meeting, what worked well? And if not, what do we need to change the next time we have a meeting? And isn't it awesome for somebody to be able to say, not everything went well, and I'm willing to hear what you have to say to make it better. And that is a closure in every meeting, whether you're sitting at an executive cabinet meeting with the deputy superintendent or whether you're sitting at a grade level planning meeting in a school. What went well and what can we change in the future? And using this rolling agenda template allows you to revisit the what went well and what do we need to change in the future. So you don't just say it needs to be changed, you're actually going to change it. We use this structure in our leadership development programs, and we have an aspiring principals program that we need to come together. We put all of the documents in there. So the benefit for assistant principals and principals in a building is with so many collaborative plannings and grade level meetings and content meetings going on, you can actually see what's going on in the meeting without physically being present. You can make comments in there, and it archives the information. So before if you're in a weekly planning meeting, you sit down and you begin, so what did we talk about? Let's go back in the agenda and figure out what we talked about, because the next steps, And the plus deltas are right at the top of the agenda. This is, falls into the step one of the data-wise process, is setting effective meetings. It all falls under organizing for collaborative work. The rolling agenda, I think for many of us, although it was a very technical aspect, getting used to Google Docs, getting used to doing links and all of that, it has become an unbelievable adaptive area where we really have gotten better at what we do because of the structure. So what we thought we would do for the last maybe about 5 minutes so we can end up taking questions is to talk through a discipline system as a big rock. You know, many schools look and reevaluate their discipline each year, and so we thought we would talk through, Debbie and I would talk through if we were going to implement either one, a new discipline system, or two, an opportunity to revamp what a school might currently have. And again, when we talk about a discipline system, maybe it's a formal PBIS program. Maybe it's an internal referral system. Maybe it's a consequence system that we're using. So when we use the term discipline system, we wanted to make sure that it kind of covered a lot of different you know, opportunities and some themes. So if we were going to look at a discipline system, what culture do we have in the building? How is discipline viewed right now? Is it really exercising authority all the time? Or do we, when we talk about discipline, are there aspects that we actually reward students for positive discipline? Or do we only focus on negative? And so when you look at it, and the other part is looking at a discipline system, what if we don't have one? Where do I start? Have they ever talked about discipline before? Has that ever been a discussion that's been that's come up? So when you look at the culture when it comes to discipline system, is what culture do we have to talk about discipline? And then if we were going to change the structure, do we actually take a look at what previously had, or are we going to throw that all out the window? And how would that feel if we said, well, we're going to start a new discipline system? I guarantee you there's going to be individuals that would say, well, what about the old one? Why are we getting rid of that one? What data do you have to support that we need to completely throw it out and start over? So, you know, culture allows you to take a look at what would it feel like for a change. The next piece is what system. How do we collect, what system do we have in place for discipline? Do we need to, again, start all over, or is there an actual discipline system? And systems and structures, as Debbie and I were speaking and kind of getting ready for today, is they can be interchanged depending on the nature of how they're presented. So is there a formal structure? Do you have a PBIS matrix that is displayed throughout the whole building? Meaning what is the expectation for walking in the hallway? What's the expectation for the cafeteria? Is there a formal structure in place, or is that something that's going to be new? If a student or a teacher walks in the building and they see the structure, they're going to be like, what? That, or have we discussed the structure with them? And then we have talked pretty heavily around stakeholders. Who needs to be part of this revamping of the discipline system, or starting is it every classroom teacher? I know one of the biggest struggles at the elementary level was what is appropriate for some of our primary students is not appropriate for our 5th and 6th grade students. So do I have people at the table that are going to be having their voices heard? And, you know, in a larger building like that of a high school, do I have every grade level, every content area representative? Students act differently in math than they do in a encore or a elective class. Do I have a voice from the electives to be able to say, you know what, they don't act up in my class. It's guitar or it's chorus. They really do well. And then I have an academic person. Well, I see them in reading, and they really act up. Well, maybe that's a hard area for them. So when you look at stakeholders, and going back to Debbie's question on who should be there, do you have everybody in the room that is going to be all of their voices heard? And it doesn't mean that it has to be 50 people. It just has to be somebody that's going to represent that voice. And lastly, for resources, do you need to have money allocated for a reward system? Do you need to have human resources allocated for a in-school suspension if it's going to be a discipline system? So have you looked at the resources? And for many of us, it might, especially as we end the school year, that looking, well, the discipline system's not working. We need to revamp it. We need to do it now. Do you have the culture to change your discipline system in the middle of the school year, or do we have to just implement what we're doing with Fidelity right now and revamp it over the summer? And when we look at some of these big rocks at a school level, it doesn't mean that it's not a bad idea. It just might not. It just might mean not now. So many times when we look at some of our new ideas, we have to not just run in and jump in. We've got to take a look. What is the culture, the system, the structure, the stakeholders, and the resources to implement and to make this adaptive change in our schools? So kind of a couple final quotes that really spoke to me as I presented this previously was, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And that really speaks to how do you create this adaptive work for yourself. And I don't want to lose sight of, I truly believe that it will be a happier place. You will have a more fulfilling job experience if you live in the adaptive world. And finally, Albert Einstein spoke of, out of clutter finds simplicity, from discord finds harmony, and in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. So in the middle of your most difficult technical work, where you feel like you're constantly just exercising authority, are there opportunities to create adaptive work? Are there truly places where you can make it both better for yourself, but in the end it's going to be better in hitting that instructional core, when we go back to that coherence framework, that inner circle of the teacher, the content, and the student. I want to thank everybody for their time. We do have the next slide has some resources. If you hadn't had an opportunity to look at the Wallace Foundation, it has a wealth of resources for leadership. I did link in the data-wise improvement process, and of course areas that I go to on a regular basis are NAESP and our NASSP websites. They're wonderful resources for both leadership development, but also just kind of organizations for collective work and being able to network. Next. So we wanted to spend the last 5 minutes in a question and answer period, and I believe if you type your questions in the question box, our facilitator Honor would be able to provide us with those questions that we might be able to address. So we'll go ahead and use the last couple of minutes for questions, and you can just type them in your question box, which is on your right-hand side of your screen.
So, Susan, while we're waiting to see if we have any other questions, first of all, I want to thank you for this great presentation. And so, as we were talking about, the framework and the template that you shared with us, you mentioned it being a thought partner for yourself. And I'm going to go back even further in your presentation when you were presenting the work around HIFITs. I'm a big fan of HIFITs, and one of his best quotes from his Leadership on the Line book is that leaders really need to take the time to get off the dance floor and get on the balcony and look over at what's going on that involves their work. And so it's one of the things that I really encourage leaders to do, because I know that the work is so intense, and when you think about being a school leader, it's thinking on your feet, and you're making those quick decisions. But it is so important to carve out that time of reflection, and the template that you shared is a great way to go about doing this.
It truly does. I think it allows, as I've been in, I share with you some of these leadership development team meetings with our assistant principals, and their principals will say, I just want you to think before you act. And I just want you to think through all of these things. And so those 5 words, and sometimes we just need this visible reminder, because, for many of us, and I think without having the research to back it up, I guarantee you that achiever and responsibility, those 2 themes from Strength Finders, are in many educators, that we have this unbelievable responsibility to try to do the work and to do it well. And when it comes to achiever is making sure that it gets done, that's something that we can check off in our box. So many of our assistant principals are struggling because they'll get a discipline issue or they'll get a parent concern, and they want to check off that it's done. But in the attempt at getting it done, it also, they might make some adaptive mistakes during that time period because they have not thought about the culture, the system, the structure. And so I've encouraged them to put it by their phone, to put it on their desktop as, before I jump to action, because I'm an achiever and I want to get it done, and I want to tell my principal that I resolved it or that I took care of it. Have I actually thought through some of that? And when you create the master schedule or the duty schedule, the achiever says, I need to get it done, but have I actually thought through those different lenses?
Right, and I think by nature, many of us who go into school leadership, I call us fixers. We're fixers within our own families. We're the go-to person to fix things within our families, and we carry that into our job, and it's so important to take that time to be reflective and taking time for yourself. When I work with principals, one of the things that I shared with them is like what you hear on an airline, many times you're going to have to stop and put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you're good for everybody else. And so I think if there's any important takeaway today, it's letting leaders know the importance of taking care of themselves and this very noble work that we do every day.
Very much so. I think it also speaks to, it goes back again, and I know I've mentioned it so many times, it speaks to the culture, is you can't take care of other people unless you've taken care of yourself, and being able to cultivate your own behaviors so that you are in a place where I do feel good about the work that I do, and how I interact with people are going to make it a better place for the work to get done, because the work gets messy sometimes, and we speak about that in the DataWise process all the time, that when the work gets messy, if you've organized for collaborative work, if you know how to work together, when the decisions become hard or the work gets a little frustrating, you know how to interact with it. You've already established that behavior. So I know that we're running short of time, and Debbie, I really appreciate Debbie Tyler jumped in and was able to facilitate this with me. So I really appreciate your time and your input and your valuable resources that you provided today.
Absolutely. And before we go, you talked about culture. I just want to commend Prince George's County Public Schools because you are doing such great work, and I've been a part of, seeing your alignment and how deep your structures go. So again, congratulations to Prince George's County and the great work that they continue to do. So just to give people a quick heads up, we'll also be doing some additional webinars, coming up webinars on unpacking the 2015 professional standards for educational leaders. There's another webinar that we'll be conducting on finding your leadership voice. So please pay attention to our different emails and ways of communicating with you on these really great webinars that we're hosting. So again, I want to thank all of our participants, and most importantly, I want to thank you, Susan, for giving us your time today.
No problem. Thank you again, Debbie, for all of your support.
All right. Take care, everybody.